good. Hey everyone, it's Alyssa here. If you see me looking down here, that's because that's where my phone is. I also go by Lyss or Alsira, whichever is okay. I'm in my pajamas today. We will be continuing to dive into the poems in my latest collection, DETHROEZ. Along with my debut collection, Kaleidoscope, DETHROEZ is available via Barnes & Noble and Amazon. I did do a video analyzing all of the poems for Kaleidoscope, but because it was 22 poems, it was a pretty lengthy video, and I don't want to put that kind of stress on my iPad or my program again.
I am not doing that again! You can't make me!
So for DETHROEZ, I decided to make it a series where each video will focus on at least 5 or 6 poems. There are poems that have their own video, like You Always Write Sad Songs and Wrath No Greater, because those were released as singles. Rainbow was also released as a single, but I didn't have enough time or energy to give this own analysis video, so that's in part 1. All videos regarding DETHROEZ are in the playlist titled DETHROEZ. Disclaimers: ideas and opinions expressed in these poems do not reflect my own, unless otherwise specified. The speaker is not always a poet, unless otherwise specified. I have a bachelor's in English, concentrating in creative writing, as well as a master's of fine art in creative writing. Despite that, I am not an expert in English language or literature, nor on the craft of writing. That doesn't mean you shouldn't try to ask me questions about that. Without further ado, let's dive into some poems. Plague. This was about chronic illness, especially in women and female bodies. The reason why I say female bodies is because I don't want to exclude assigned female at birth non-binaries or trans men, because even though they did not identify as women, some still do have the anatomy of a female body and therefore may deal with issues that women may experience. It's called being inclusive. If I see anyone in the comments trying to argue this point, I'm kicking your ass out. Anyways, the poem was originally titled Please Make Death Die. The reason why is because it's supposed to stand for PMDD, which is premenstrual dysphoric disorder. It's like PMS, but with suicidal thoughts and more severe symptoms like phantom cramps and all that. If you want to learn more, I will attach a few links down below in the description. Growing up, I had a lot of issues with my body, especially in the reproductive area. I had irregular periods, hair growing on my upper lip and along my jawline. And I still remember in my old neighborhood, I was playing hide and seek with a few kids, and being a neurodivergent kid I was with little friends, I told them I was a girl with a mustache. And so, while I'm hiding, one of the kids pointed me out and shouted, "There's the girl with the mustache!" Yes, let the entire borough of Queens know that. So this poem is about the struggle to lose weight and deal with an unknown chronic illness and the industry of fitness and weight loss. At the time of writing this, I was under the notion that I had PCOS, polycystic ovarian syndrome, which is when a woman or female person has more androgen than estrogen, basically more of the hormone found in men or male bodies than the other. Because of this hormonal imbalance, women or AFAB folks tend to grow facial hair on their upper lip and jawline, have irregular periods, weight gain, difficulty getting pregnant, loss of acne, and etc. According to an endocrinologist and gynecologist, it does seem like I have PCOS, but I never had a scan on my ovarian area. The reason why that procedure is performed is to find any follicles or the cyst on the ovaries, because they grow on the organs and can disrupt the daily life. Not everyone who has PCOS has follicles on their ovaries. Currently speaking with my gynecologist about that, and that's private information that I'm not going to disclose. When I talk about struggles, and especially personal struggles, I tend to be dramatic and use a lot of imagery and analogies. I always tend to rant a little bit. Crawling out of a well and the water thickening like a glacier, pretty dramatic. But with that image, you understand what the speaker is coming from. It's an arduous and very time-consuming journey. I've had several drafts of this poem, including one where each stanza started with a letter from the acronym PCOS or PMDD. I kept this poem a bit vague in specifying what kind of illness the speaker was going through, because I wanted this to be as inclusive as possible. I wanted others to read and relate to this and not feel like they can't talk about it, even if they don't have it. It touches on a topic of medical negligence and how women and AFAB folks are often overlooked when it comes to chronic illnesses and invisible disabilities. We've seen the headlines of women being told to lose weight by one doctor, but the other doctor ends up finding a tumor the size of a football. It's only been recent that women were allowed to be tested for medicinal trials, and that's fucking shocking because what do you mean women weren't allowed until now? That means a lot of our medication was based on the male body and what men go through. Testicles do not ovulate. The penis does not bleed, and if it does, see a doctor. I believe this poem reveals a few problems I have with my poetry, and that is overwriting and hopping from one topic to the next. Is this confusing? Disorienting? Definitely not intended, and I feel I should have separated this into several poems, expand on those ideas a little bit. I've always been a little conscious about length and not wanting to cut out the good parts, and that's why I always hire an editor to help me. Editors, they give you like suggestions, so you can either keep those suggestions or not keep them. Having a third party take a look at your work, fresh eyes, no idea about your career, it's a good idea, especially when you have knowledge on the market. What I didn't have were beta readers. Other than my family, I had no one else. I even sent out a form on my platforms and not one person signed up. I wasn't going to charge beta readers because I didn't have that kind of money. You make do with what you have. Devil and her smile. Oh, this was a crazy one among others. I've always wanted to write about honor killings and femicide, especially since they're pretty common in certain cultures like Islam. I'm not saying every Muslim is like this, because they're not. I was once a Muslim. A lot of you take this religion very seriously, and you put way too much pressure on women and teenage girls. So, Devil takes a more satirical approach and saying how it's the woman's fault for attracting men and not fulfilling her wifely duties. I trust my audience to know that this was satire and that I would never support oppression of women. She drugs her husband so she can sneak off to the bonfire and honor her sister taken too soon. Why did she drug her husband? Because just like every other man in the village, he beat the crap out of her and treated her like shit because that's what everyone was taught. And the women have had enough. Fire is one of the elements featured in this collection, and it can represent so many things, depending on how it's written. In this piece, it represents passion, fury, and the ever-loving determination of a revolution. It also plays into the creation-destruction cycle, and that's one of the concepts I'm working on for my next poetry book. That will be its own video later on. There were a few words that were changed around. For instance, instead of superior, it was father. I liked it, but I didn't like it. It felt like it was supporting child abuse, but it also was demonstrating the cycle of abuse through a patriarchal view. But let's take it further and make it superior, because that's the dynamic. The husband is not being the father to his wife. He's acting as a superior through violence. Still, on the topic of fire, with most poems you want to end on an image. That was a note that my editor gave to me, so an army of fireflies it was. I mean, there was fire. This can also be viewed as a piece on female rage, just like how Rainbow was a piece on female rage, just to a storm, or like a hurricane of some sort. Performavist. We're going to tone it back a bit and criticize feminists and performative activism. This was a quick one, done in like one sitting. When it comes to you, it comes to you. We're not strangers to current events. Since the very first war, there has been protest. Since the very first dictator, there has been protest. And as protests continue to evolve, so does the social climate. Now, protest movements have become more divided than united, and social media really takes this to a whole new level. Like, you have to be either the most vigilant activist or you're a traitor. You have to be the most outspoken person, but not on those topics. You have to take it to the streets, but don't you dare make me late for work. I think a lot of people forget that protests are supposed to be disruptive, otherwise it's just a rally. Without saying much, you kind of figure out what kind of person the speaker is speaking to, and the speaker doesn't hold back. There were some funny parts, like the great white feminist, or the potato salad loving mom. I was thinking of a few people when I was writing this, and if you figure them out, you figured them out. I can neither deny nor confirm. When it comes to critiquing feminism, you're gonna get a side eye, especially from white women. There's some kind of like gatekeeping that white women do when it comes to activism. They're very selective about who they care about and who is allowed into their circle of activism. Now, when I'm talking about white women, I'm not talking about all white women. I'm just talking about the white women who actually do this shit. And if you're a white woman who doesn't do this shit, then this is not about you. I'm gonna tell you this, there's no sign-up sheet for a protest or a rally, you just show up. I need you to know that this poem, and any other poem right like this, isn't just about one singular event. It's an accumulation. And this is the same thing I said about River Nation in the community post, which is coming up soon. Don't run away with this poem thinking it only serves you. It's for everyone that is affected. Kids like us. This was a fun one. Mostly fun to write. It wasn't fun writing about gun violence and gentrification, but hey, I used comedy to handle the tough shit. The original title for this was called Renegades, because I think it involves an uprising of some sort in the original. And the original first lines were something like, "Stand down, crowned one. Defend yourself or die hiding." A bit medieval, but if I'm going to make this about gentrification and fears of childhood, I can't sound like this because it would be too childish, too not taken seriously. So I rewrote it and saved those lines for another poem, and this is more homely. What I mean is, when I was writing this poem, I thought about my old neighborhood in Queens and my dad, who was a school bus driver. He used to do runs in Brooklyn, Manhattan, and the Bronx. Now he just does Manhattan. And he's about to be laid off this Friday because apparently Friday the 31st of October, because his company's contract was now signed by the DOE, Panel of Education Policy. So now he and 150,000 school bus drivers are going to be laid off. And I fucking hate that. Hey, a bit of an update to that. So, on the night of October 30th, my dad's company and other companies affected by this was alerted that a 1 month extension was added to their original contract. So, my dad is good for the entire month of November, thankfully. I think what is happening is that they're trying to play this out until the next mayor is elected, so just so see what the next mayor will do. Now, my family and I, we live on Long Island in Nassau County. That is just right next to New York City, so we cannot vote in the city. However, we do work in the city, so that part of our lives is affected by this election. So just a little update, and not to worry anyone. My family was definitely worried. And we had some other stuff happen, but, we're taking care of all that behind the scenes. Times are tough, and you really don't want to fuck with people's money. Back then, over 10 years ago, when he used to pick up and drop children off at school and vice versa, the neighborhoods were pretty rough. Not the ones you see on a postcard. In 2020, I started volunteering with City Harvest, an organization that gives out food to those less fortunate. I don't do much work with them as of late, internships not being my favorite in terms of location and traveling, because I live on Long Island, so I mostly take the railroad and the subway. Anyways, one of the final shifts I did with City Harvest was giving out food at a church in Brooklyn, I believe it's St. Stephen's. At that time, I didn't have a driver's license, so my dad had to drop me off and then pick me up. As we're driving through this neighborhood, my dad realized that this is where one of his first runs were, and that this neighborhood had completely changed according to his experience. If he didn't see the street signs, he would not have recognized it. He didn't see a lot of police cars or homeless people, and there was a lot of trendy restaurants and young white people there. That was a few years ago, and it always stuck with me, so I brought that into this poem, and how the speaker was driven out of his neighborhood, wasn't able to come back to live because it got so expensive, and like, he just didn't recognize his home anymore. I should have added a little more detail to his neighborhood and given more emotional attachment, but it being vague enough, some of you may relate, you may like even insert your own experience in there. Now, I did reference Gwendolyn Brooks. She is, or was because she's dead, a poet and teacher born in Kansas, and a lot of her work focused on her community and the struggles and celebrations of her community. She was the first African American to receive a Pulitzer Prize for her poetry book Annie Allen. Plus, she was on the stamp. That's so cool. I referenced her because this poem sort of ran along the lines for her poem, We Real Cool. In fact, even close to that title. I bring this in because it takes it down to earth, and it's not just a figment off my mind. This poem also talked about like gun violence and restriction on queer expression, and what are we doing to keep our youth safe? Also touches on capitalism, like that strip mall that replaced the speaker's home with tons of sales, but nothing to sell. This is one of my favorite poems, and its final stanza transitions us into the next poem. Ruination. This is probably one of the more controversial ones in my opinion. I don't type out my opinions often. I often share my I share a lot on my Instagram stories, and I add my 2 cents. Poetry is an outlet for those kind of opinions because it's proof that I actually care and not a mindless drone sucked into the machine. A poem that's currently in my next collection. Anyways, like I said in my community post and why I said about Performivist, there wasn't a singular event that inspired this poem. It was an accumulation of events. It was learning about atrocities committed by other countries upon others and themselves, civil wars, genocides, world wars, Holocaust, slavery, and it's every possible unforgiving act of violence that you could possibly think of. With that said, I cannot conclude every single event in such a poem, otherwise we'd be here for a long ass time. This is one of the longest poems so far, and it did take a lot to record, edit, and even make the visuals. Similar situation as in Plague, overriding, hopping from one topic to the next, and even bouncing back and forth. Still, a story is being created. There were a few journalists that inspired the speaker. Let me say this, I have never lived in a war zone. My town was never attacked like this. I do not have the same childhood as the speaker. I do not want this poem to be speaking over others who have lived this. I want this poem to be a microphone for those who aren't being heard. As an American, I have more power in my voice than someone who's not American. However, I'm not a white American, so my voice can only be as loud as it can be. If it invites controversy, so be it. I will never apologize for what I fight for. I am not a perfect activist. I am not a perfect person. That cannot be expected of me, and neither should it be expected of survivors to be perfect, because we are human beings. And these survivors survived the genocide. They escaped the genocide. This is going to take time for them to adjust to like a new normal while they're watching the home being destroyed and be used as a prop for propaganda. They still have a target on their back. They can't return home. Do you realize how heartbreaking that is? That's pretty much what I have for this poem. Dark Arts 2. Second poem in the series of Dark Arts. Takes on a different topic as the previous one, which can be found in its own video in part 3 of my DETHROEZ poem analyses. Unlike the first Dark Arts, this one was a bit challenging to write because not only of the villanelle structure, but the rhyming too. Judging by the lines, this is about isolation and fearing the unknown, and it really brings in like this like childhood aspect and saying you're stuck in this like memory forever, or you're stuck in this like helpless child position forever. The final stanza really tries to stop the person from leaving, saying that they'll be targeted, they won't know what to do in the real world. It's giving the Truman Show, like how Christoph was making sure that Truman couldn't leave through like ads and saying like there's no place like home, or learn the world from just being home. The thing about poetry is playing with words and sentence structure. One of my favorite moments is the first 2 lines of the final stanza, which is, "It'll only be a matter of time before you're marked out there. So many things you don't even know." There's no punctuation after marked, so it's marked out there, but then it follows with so many things you don't even know. So out there plays on as if it's part of 2 complete thoughts, joining both in the stanza. If you like the Dark Arts series, don't worry, there's more coming in this next poetry book. The only connection the series has is that they share the same name and similar tone. That is all for this video. If you have reached this far, please leave a fruit emoji in the comments. I have more readings to be uploaded next month and so forth. When this poetry run has concluded, I will have a video commencing the end of the DETHROEZ era, but is it over yet? I will go into more detail about my debut novel, which is nearly done with the first draft. Please support me any way you can. I have affiliate links in my link tree, as well as my first 2 books, Kaleidoscope and DETHROEZ, which are available on Amazon and Barnes & Noble. If you have a topic you'd like me to talk about, please let me know in the comments down below. I do have the right to refuse a topic if I feel uncomfortable talking about it. Make sure to be safe and hydrate.